the way Americans fly. We've all become very accustomed to checking luggage at curbs and dashing in and out of airports. Could we be looking at something like El Al security, and is the American public willing to put up with that in massive inconvenience?
We do show some acceptance of that at this point, based in part upon concern over how this occurred. The public divides almost evenly on whether the authorities did all they reasonably could to prevent this or not. Now, nonetheless, now with this having happened, around 9 in 10 express at least some confidence that those responsible will be caught and punished. And also, we find that vast majorities, again, around 9 in 10 Americans, say they support military action against groups or nations found to be responsible, even if that means going to war.
It's interesting, that 91% figure, because in other cases of attacks, it actually hasn't been very easy for the United States government to figure out who was behind them and to bring those people to justice.
In this poll, even 54% are even very confident that those responsible can be found and caught. Now, there's some rallying around the flag there that you're going to find. There's broad concern and also resolve. Another interesting result, I think, is the remarkable extent to which these attacks have really focused the nation's attention. 99% of adults, basically everyone, have watched or listened to broadcast reports of this event. 91% say they prayed for the families or the victims. 4 in 10 employed people across the country left work early or didn't go to work today. Nearly 3 in 10 Americans, over 50 million people, say they called or emailed a friend or a relative in New York or Washington to see if they were okay.
Indeed, the frantic sort of reaching out to see if loved ones, people you care about, are in fact involved or may have been victimized in some way.
Completely across America.
It's so interesting to see yet again how something like this, a tragedy on this scale, really becomes a uniting thing or factor for this country. People all over sort of sitting down watching and in horror as this all unfolded.
It's quite remarkable how it is utterly and completely focused and commanded the nation's attention and then created these really nearly unanimous views in terms of actions the government can and should take.
All right, Gary Langer, thanks for that polling data. We're going to very quickly update you as we take a look at some new pictures from this evening for rescue workers. It's been another long and difficult day. They have converged by the dozens at the site of the World Trade Center to look for survivors and bodies amid the rubble of the Trade Center's twin towers. Both towers struck by 2 hijacked commercial jets, both towers collapsing a short time thereafter. Some 300 firefighters are believed among the victims. They were in the towers trying to evacuate them. Some 50,000 people work in those Trade Center towers every day. We don't know how many they were able to evacuate or not, but 300 firefighters we know were in the process of doing just that, and they are feared dead, killed, also victims in this. Officials say it could be weeks before we know the final death toll. Crews are also on the scene at the Pentagon, where another hijacked jetliner slammed into that building yesterday. There has been no credible claim of responsibility for the attacks orchestrated here in New York or in Washington, D.C. at this point. Whoever was behind it managed to pull off an incredibly well-orchestrated and devastatingly effective act of terrorism. But officials say suspected terrorist mastermind Osama bin Laden is a prime suspect. We have here, just to our desk, a report from the Boston Herald saying that authorities in Massachusetts have identified at least 5 Arab men as potential suspects in the terror attacks launched yesterday morning from Logan International Airport. They apparently have seized in the central parking garage a car laden with Arabic language flight training manuals. Of course, there's been a lot of speculation that whoever hijacked these airplanes needed to know how to fly them, being unable to convince any sane pilot to deliberately fly his commercial jet into a landmark, the Pentagon, the Trade Center towers. Also, there apparently, the sources in this Boston Herald report are saying that hijackers in one plane began to kill flight attendants on board the flight in order to lure the pilot out of the cockpit. At that point, they were able to then go into the cockpit and take control of the aircraft. Apparently, according to the source, they started killing stewardesses as a diversion. The pilot came back to help, and that's how they got into the cockpit, according to this Boston Herald report. Also, according to that report, the suspects did all of this on all 4 of the flights that you're seeing right there, 2 American Airlines flights, 2 United Airlines flights, all originating here on the East Coast from Boston, Logan Airport, from Dulles Airport, from Newark Airport, all heading to California, all heavy with fuel, airline fuel, and apparently, according to the Boston Herald report, the suspects used knives that they had hidden in their shaving kits and other carry-on luggage. And that was how they were able to smuggle these weapons on board. No guns were used, but apparently the knife-like weapons were made up of plastic handles embedded with razor blade, according to sources in this Boston Herald report. Indeed, authorities were led to the rental car by a civilian who apparently said got into some sort of an altercation with these suspects, with several Arab men as they were parking their car, which was apparently some sort of sedan. The man, whose name was not available last night, called state police from an out-of-town airport to report that he had gotten into this argument with these suspects to check out the car. They, in fact, did, and found this Arab language literature as well as training manuals. Two of the suspects, two of the men apparently, whose passports were traced to the United Arab Emirates, are brothers, according to this report, one of whom was a trained pilot. That's all in the Boston Herald. Obviously something, this is a huge crime investigation being launched right now. Federal agents going over the flight manifests on all four of these commercial jets, trying to figure out who on board was in fact beyond this, trying to trace this back to the source. Lower Manhattan and the Pentagon, an enormous crime scene, as well as the scene of an enormous tragedy of historic proportions. I want to bring you up to date with some more information we're gleaning from this Boston Herald article, which quotes unnamed sources as saying that 5 Arab suspects have now been listed as 5 Arab men have been listed as suspects in yesterday's terrorist attacks. 2 of them brothers who were both on board United Airlines Flight 175. It was en route from Logan's Boston International Airport to Los Angeles. It was the second jet to slam into one of the 2 towers at the World Trade Center this morning. Apparently, another airline passenger at the Boston airport got into an argument with the men when they were parking their car at the airport. And when he heard, after landing in another city, about what had happened, called the FBI, said, "I think you need to check this out." The FBI has apparently seized the car. It was a rental car that was reportedly being driven by these suspects, several Arab men. And inside, they have reported to have found Arab language flight training manuals. One of the 2 brothers who was on board United Airlines Flight 175 was apparently a trained pilot. There's been a lot of speculation that whoever was behind these hijackings needed to know how to fly this plane. In this article as well are more details that apparently, according to sources, the hijackers began to kill flight attendants on board the plane so as to lure the pilot out of the cockpit, to get him to leave the cockpit, come back into the plane to try and restore some order, and that is the point at which hijackers took control of the cockpit. Several flight attendants were able to call, several passengers were able to call on cell phones, and in addition, we're being told that at least one pilot in the cockpit was able to depress his key so that people in the air traffic control tower could hear everything that was going on in the cockpit at the time. They report the hijackers were, in fact, speaking English to the pilot, reassuring him not to do anything foolish. You're not going to get hurt, which, of course, was most definitely not the case. And finally, Robert Fitzpatrick, a former second in command of the FBI's Boston office, says that Boston appears to have been the staging area for this attack on New York City and in Washington, D.C., and that the hijackers most likely had help from others who may still be in the Boston area. According to Fitzpatrick, a quote, "There is a terrorist cell operating out of Boston." So once again, to recap, we have rescuers down in Lower Manhattan still working, trying to get people from under that rubble. An exhausting and delicate and dangerous task. Many of the buildings there are still considered unstable. Fires still burning. There have been a few survivors pulled from the rubble, pulled from the wreckage after those 2 twin towers collapsed, and then a 3rd building yesterday afternoon also collapsing. But at this point, we have absolutely no handle on how many people may have been hurt or killed in this devastating attack. Suffice it to say that the casualties will be massive, as Mayor Giuliani put it here in New York City, more than any of us can bear. Among the casualties, more than 300 firefighters who were trying to evacuate the area. You can see Lower Manhattan it looks like a war zone. It's nothing like it. No electricity. It's being lit by emergency floodlights as crews put in enormous hours for this tremendously difficult task of sorting through the wreckage and the rubble there. While they're doing that, the similar work is going on at the Pentagon, which is still burning at this hour. Flames, in fact, keeping many people from being able to get in and unearth the victims there. Jim Sciutto, ABC's Jim Sciutto, is standing outside there. Jim, any progress on extinguishing the flames at the Pentagon?
We have not seen flames come out of the top of the roof of the Pentagon for quite some time now. As I said a couple of hours ago, what the firemen are doing is called trenching on the roof of the building, where they physically break it open to get access to the flames, but that causes them to jump up because the flames get more oxygen to feed on. But we haven't seen that for quite some time, although they are still, as you can see, spraying the building with water.
And in fact, as they do this, as they extinguish these flames, and as they hope to eventually begin to search for the victims buried there, work continues in the Pentagon. Very important work.
Absolutely. Work continuing in the National Military Command Center, where we don't know that he's left, but until a short time ago, we know that Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld was there with no plans to leave, although we can't confirm that he is still there. That is kind of the headquarters for the military in a situation like this. I can tell you that they actually activated a crisis action in that National Military Command Center even before the plane crashed here at the Pentagon. Once they had word of the first plane hitting one of the World Trade Center towers in New York, they were in a crisis mode here, and then of course a plane hit them, although they're on the other side of the building. We also spoke earlier with other offices in the Pentagon that had hundreds of people at work as we speak.
Jim, I know that you're outside the Pentagon, being kept at some distance away because it is obviously a crime scene, a scene of great tragedy, but have you been able to get any information on when, for example, those ships that were sent to come patrol off the coast of New York City, off Washington, D.C., when those aircraft carriers might be arriving?
We just know that they have left. The USS Comfort, a hospital ship out of Baltimore, on its way, and also the aircraft carrier you mentioned on its way as well, but we don't know when they're going to arrive.
All right, Jim Sciutto, thank you so much. Already in lower Manhattan, they have been taking many of the victims. There are all sorts of triage areas, MASH units. Many victims are being ferried from the lower Manhattan over to New Jersey, where they're receiving care there. But obviously, with the massive number of victims and the temporary morgue being set up for the massive number of casualties expected, this is a huge, titanic, logistical nightmare as well for these rescuers who are trying to do so much. Just a few moments ago, we were listening to former Secretary of State Lawrence Eagleburger talk about the swift and severe response. My colleague, ABC's Derek McGinty, is joining me now. Derek, you've been perusing some of these editorials in different newspapers. Strong language there, too.
Indeed. It seems as though the spirit of what Lawrence Eagleburger spoke of, the need to strike back and the need to be very tough and the need to realize that this is not something you can wait for the international legal organizations to deal with, is the spirit especially found in, for example, the Washington Post editorial, which says basically if the attack originated abroad, it is an act of war. Some have even said in that editorial that war should be declared by the U.S. Congress if they can find the nerve to do that. It's the kind of thing where, again, if you look in the historical analog of how we've handled these things in the past, we've sort of waited for the legal system to take its course. For example, with the 2 Libyans that were recently convicted in the bombing of the plane over Lockerbie, they're basically saying that's not enough anymore. If we're going to act, we have to act quickly, and we have to make people know, as Lawrence Eagleburger said, there's a price to be paid when you do these sort of things, and that America has the will to act, and that's what the editorial is saying.
And in fact, as mirroring other comments, which has said any countries harboring this terrorist, i.e. Afghanistan, will bear the consequences of this as well. This is not just an attack on, if, for example, Osama bin Laden was deemed responsible for this, it wouldn't be just retaliation to his cell, but to Afghanistan or any other country sheltering the terrorists.
In fact, the President Bush did hint at this in the speech he made tonight, where he said, we will treat the countries that harbor these people the same as we treat these people. I think, as Peter Jennings said so many times earlier, we can't jump to conclusions. We don't know exactly who did this. We don't even know that it was Osama bin Laden, though the evidence seems to point more and more in that direction. But